Joining us now to discuss is CoinDesk Director of Data and Indexes, Galen Moore in Boston. Hello there, Galen. So Bitcoin hit an all-time high of at $68,990 this morning. ETH also breaking records at 4,865, and this time it was during North American day trading hours, shortly after CPI data was released. What's going on, Galen?
I think, look, if we continue to see sticker shock inflation numbers like that, it's going to be good for Bitcoin. And really, the way in which it's good for Bitcoin is that it tends to seem to drive Bitcoin and the stock market apart. Bitcoin, as we've seen these days, and we've talked about this, Christine, where Bitcoin seems to be moving with growth stocks. On a day like this, you see Bitcoin continuing to do its own thing, and maybe even to some extent benefiting from the inflation narrative. Although, as you pointed out earlier, we're about back where we started the U.S. trading day at this point. But, look, stock investors spooked on the damage that inflation can do to earnings and the cost of money. I think it's getting harder and harder to really hang on to this idea that it's just transitory inflation. Whether it is or not, inflation is a really strong narrative right now. People are talking about it at all levels, from the Fed down to people talking about, the price of turkey on a Thanksgiving dinner table. So I think it's a strong narrative, and that can only be beneficial for people who are thinking about Bitcoin in the long term. And on a day like today, you really do see Bitcoin kind of shining as, to some extent, digital gold, right? Distancing itself from the narrative of a risk-on asset that moves with growth stocks.
I kind of cut you off there, but you were talking about the stock market as well. The stocks are falling about 0.5 to 1.5% today. Is there a decoupling going on between Bitcoin, the crypto markets, and the traditional stock markets?
Well, I don't think there has been much of a coupling in the first place. We did see things move a little closer, moving in step a little bit more than they had been, but Bitcoin continues to be a largely uncorrelated asset. And it hasn't become, as much as I think it's kind of raised eyebrows, the extent to which it's become weakly positively correlated with stocks this year. And that always raises the question of, is that going to be a long-term trend? On a day like today, I think you see, Bitcoin proving its worth in a portfolio, which, was where, sort of its place in a portfolio is as an uncorrelated asset and an inflation hedge in the long term.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Coinbase earnings. Didn't turn out as well. Actually, it was kind of expected that it may not turn out too well. Here's a chart, though, on supported custody and trading assets. So what were your thoughts on the results?
Yeah, I feel like it's sort of Robinhood all over again. I really don't think Wall Street should have been surprised at the dip in volume and active users. Q3 was a down quarter in volume, and the numbers are there in terms of what people. If people want to see where most of Coinbase's revenue comes from is fees on trading. If you want to see how much trading is happening, that's quite visible. Of course, there's always some question about what percentage of that is large investors who maybe are charged a lower fee, and what percentage is smaller investors who maybe pay a higher percentage. But at the same time, the sort of disappointment here in the near 10% drop in the stock, that kind of. So I have to scratch my head. Look, I mean, the most important thing for crypto investors in general is, I think, the increase in institutional trading, or rather the sort of slower decrease, increase in institutional trading as a percentage of Coinbase's business, and also the increase in altcoins, which is highlighted in this chart here. Coinbase added about 25 new cryptocurrencies and crossed 100 in terms of the number they're supporting for trading. So altcoins beyond Bitcoin and Ether are now 59% of their volume. That's up from 50% in Q2 and 40% in Q1. So, look, when you see that share of trading volume from institutions, what they term institutions, which I think are really just large investors, large traders, crossing 70% for the first time, large traders to some extent kept going, even as retail lost steam in Q3. And I think that reinforces that narrative, which has been current. And it seems likely that at least some of that large investor activity is in currencies beyond Bitcoin or Ether. And I think that's critical. I mean, the growth in other, right, the other category, as Coinbase terms it, is too large to be driven by retail alone, to my eye. So, large investors are to some extent participating in these altcoin markets. They're in deeper than just an investment in Bitcoin that they can liquidate to juice returns before end of year. And we're looking at data from a month and a half ago, but I think it's a useful window into how larger investors were positioned coming into the fourth quarter, and what that will mean for how they'll play this run in the second half of the quarter.
So, we saw ETH hit an all-time high just shortly after Bitcoin hit an all-time high. So the story, the one narrative goes, well, ETH just follows what Bitcoin does, or is it because there is an interest in other going beyond Bitcoin?
I think in terms of Ethereum, it has a kind of a natural appeal for investors who are familiar with technology investments, right? That Ethereum has that technology story. Bitcoin, of course, digital gold, very different. I think Alex Kruger was pointing out on Twitter today, people who have hedged against inflation have performed terribly. Investors who have done that have performed terribly unless they bought Bitcoin. So I think two very different stories. Yes, they certainly do. If you want to talk correlations, look at Bitcoin and almost any other crypto, very strong positive correlation in the 0.8, 0.85 range. I think we see times where that drifts apart, right? Where Ethereum is doing its own thing. This year has been one of those stories as I think more and more large investors began to take serious interest in Ethereum. And from there, it's this kind of, red pill rabbit hole type scenario. I don't think it takes long for you to be looking at Ethereum before you start maybe taking, Polkadot or Avalanche or Solana seriously as well.